Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Tonight, we have on this stage a bona fide superstar. We've had a lot of bona fide, remarkable people, rock stars, and folks here, but this woman is remarkable by even the standards of this podium. It's my great honor to introduce her. She is tonight's Pollock Lecturer, and the Gustav Pollock Lectureship was founded back in 1951 and by Leo Silver as a memorial to journalist Gustav Pollock, who wrote for The Nation and other publications in the early 20th century. And the lecture was designed to stimulate interest in government careers and research with a view towards building a better government. And tonight's speaker could not be better chosen. Now, she was incorrectly, I believe, described by Time magazine as perhaps the ultimate role model for women in science. Incorrect, I should say, because she's undoubtedly the ultimate role model for anyone in science. She's the ultimate role model for all women, and she's probably the ultimate role model for all people, as you'll hear in just a moment. She received her BS from MIT in 1968, and in 1973 she became the first African-American woman to earn a PhD from MIT. She was the second African-American woman in the United States to get a PhD in physics, ever. This, by the way, was 1973, and if you want to, that is not long ago. It is a remarkable moment. She also went from there to Bell Labs and then was appointed professor of theoretical physics at Rutgers University. Now let me just say a word about physics. I, like many of my kind, came to college thinking that maybe physics would be for me. You know, I've done like real well on the tests. I, got 5 and stuff and the APs and so on. And I quickly discovered something that many, many economists have discovered, which is they're not actually smart enough to be physicists. But they still kind of like quantitative stuff, so they do economics. And so that's kind of where I'm at. And so economists always hold physicists in awe, and especially theoretical physicists. After Rutgers, she was there until the 1990s. In 1995, she was appointed chair of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission by President Bill Clinton. And at the NRC, she reorganized the agency, completely revamped its regulatory approach by articulating and moving strongly risk-informed and performance-based regulation. Again, it was a huge change. And in an effort to foster collaboration and nuclear safety assistance worldwide, she also spearheaded the formation of the International Nuclear Regulators Association, served as its first chairperson. And it's interesting, when I was, just before we came on, I was talking to her about one of her initiatives at Rensselaer. And one of the main things is actually making sure that every student has an international experience, which is not common, in fact, in science, and yet absolutely fundamental to the world. And you can see this came early. Among her other notable achievements, she's the past president of the American Academy of Science for the Advancement of Sciences. She's the immediate past chairperson of the board of directors. She's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and so on. She has more honorary degrees than are probably present in this room, and she's a remarkable individual. But most significantly now, she became the 18th president of Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute in 1999. And during her tenure, she has shown what true leadership is, true academic leadership, but true leadership is, because she's hired 170 new faculty, enabled a significant reduction in the student-faculty ratio. They've, under her watch, $500 million of new construction has gone forth, and everything from and new facilities for research, teaching, student life, as well as the arts. And she may well talk about some of that. Research awards have doubled, and so on. But right now, and indeed for a number of years, one of her main areas of focus has been on the future of the nation and ultimately the world, and the role that science and scientists, or the lack of scientists and engineers, the difference that could make. We have a program here at the Kennedy School called Acting in Time, focusing on those issues where you better act now or you're going to regret it very big time later, and yet we often fail to act. President Jackson is actually an example of someone who is making somehow the nation act in time, think about issues. A bill is before the Congress, seems likely to pass, that is fundamentally about solving the problems she's talked about. Now, her father told her to aim for the stars. She's probably one of the few people that have heard that actually knows what's inside of stars. But she not only has aimed for the stars, she's clearly surpassed them. Would you please join me in welcoming President Shirley Ann Jackson.
Thank you. You know, it's always interesting when one is introduced, and I was just in Washington at the National Science Foundation to give a lecture, and the director of the foundation, who in fact is a good friend of mine, gave this long litany of my alleged achievements. And I said, well, you know you have arrived in Washington if someone steps to the podium and says, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. But that is not who you have this evening. But good evening. Thank all of you for being here. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, released its fourth assessment report on February 2nd of this year in Paris, calling global warming unequivocal, it became an entry point to understanding that as a planet, as nations, as individuals, we must find the leadership to make change. And to do that, we must find the leadership to trust science. And so I begin with a premise that to resolve the critical global issues which confront us at the beginning of this young century, and to assure that our planet and its people indeed have a future, it is necessary for science and leadership to coalesce in ways that we have not yet seen. To understand the premise and its implications, I would like to introduce the simple metaphor of the marketplace, or what the ancient Greeks would have called the agora. This represents the place where historically interactions occur among societal sectors and the public at large. The government occupies a quadrant. The decision makers, the legislators, the bureaucrats, the regulators, of which I was one, the policy makers, the courts, and the body of law itself. Industry and the private and economic sector, from merchants to corporations, occupy another segment. The religious sector, church, mosque, synagogue, and temple, has its place in the agora, as does academia, the educators and the students who shape the future. So the agora is the societal nexus. In the past century, things have changed. There's been an exponential rise in the volume and availability of information, which influences the perception of science, the understanding of the role of the scientist, and the acceptance of both. This volume of information influences the formation of public policy as it relates to science and technology and their use. Other influential factors and actors have appeared and are competing for the attention of both citizens and leaders. This includes the media, which convey factual information, but also filter, editorialize, and comment. It includes professional societies, and I led one. And although these have existed for centuries, their variety and profile increased dramatically in the last half of the 20th century. Think tanks offer yet another factor in the mix, and I'm on the board of one, so I know whereof I speak. Think tanks used to focus on a specific purpose or the analysis of a particular issue. Today, their numbers and their budgets have grown, and their focus often expands beyond specific issues to viewpoints, political, religious, philosophical. The hundreds of experts they employ flood the agora with journals, op-ed commentary, television and radio appearances. Virtually every aspect of public affairs, from crop subsidies to pharmaceuticals, has its own proponents and opponents. Now, compounding the difficulty of threading through this array of opinions is the sophistication of commercial marketing. Marketing was created to advertise and sell products, but now it extends to shaping the ideas conveyed to the citizen via mass communication media. And finally, we have the internet, an engine of information and disinformation without equal. Global in its reach, staggering in its power, it is transforming the age of information. But what happens when the marketplace then is populated with self-proclaimed experts, when we have authorities supporting every view, when they appear in advertising virtually everywhere, and now even on cell phones? The result is the devaluing of information, and I say the devaluing of science. This trend threatens the concept of the scientist as the dispassionate, objective voice of reason. It threatens the authoritative role of science in helping to shape sound public policy. The citizen bombarded by information is unsure which expert to believe, as are their representatives, the politicians. In such an environment, where does the scientist stand? In this environment, how does the public choose its truth and settle upon what it will accept as fact? How do our elected officials arrive at constructive decisions? What is the role played by science in the crowded agora? In such an environment, how does the scientist help to shape public policy? What happens to the individuals who speak out with facts which run counter to the prevailing view? And crucially, with what degree of trust does the average citizen regard the voice of scientific expertise? Is the voice even heard? The arena of public discourse, as you well know, abounds with controversy, and the volume and passion of the rhetoric sometimes drowns the role of science and its voice. And yet, science meets society, sometimes most explosively, where it impacts public policy, because public policy is where we chart our future. And this is where, as I said at the outset, we must find and insist upon sound leadership. Consider, as an example, the long-range import of the historic decision made by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the British Admiralty, as World War I approached. Now, Sir Winston, he was later Sir Winston, shifted the British Navy from coal power to oil to make the fleet faster than the German Navy. The oil-powered fleet, however, was now subject to insecure oil supplies from what was then Persia, rather than relying on local supplies of coal from Wales. The move forced Great Britain to engage in a new national strategy challenge, securing essential energy sources. Churchill had this advice, and I quote, "Safety and certainty in oil lie in variety and variety alone." That is his quote, a prescient statement worthy of note today. Now, a more recent example of a similar strategic move is the conversion of submarines from oil or diesel to nuclear propulsion. And I will say parenthetically that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually reviews nuclear propulsion plant designs for safety. Now, this decision, this move, clearly added greater speed, stealth, maneuverability, and length of mission for naval forces. It also placed the United States and other countries, some allies, some not, squarely into a world with many actors seeking similar advantage and looking to develop the nuclear weapons which these ships were built to deploy and use. So policy drove a technology choice here, which in turn led to other strategic policy issues, issues on the knife edge of public discourse. The propensity for science to posit knife-edge dilemmas can further confound the confusion and sometimes add to the distrust of science and technology. Of course, science is rife with knife-edge issues, offering pros and cons, positives and potential negatives, and sometimes few clear choices. Because these issues appear often at the cutting edge of science and technology, there are few, if any, precedents for guidance, which makes it yet more difficult to sort through how science meshes with public policy. So let me explore for a few minutes with you a few examples of knife-edge issues, all of which have implications for public policy. First, consider clinical trials, which test the efficacy of drugs for the very youngest among us. Children often metabolize medicines differently than do adults and experience different side effects. But the child medication market is small, and without incentives, pharmaceutical firms usually do not conduct the requisite testing to write appropriate instructions for pediatric use. To correct this, the U.S. Congress 10 years ago passed the Pediatric Exclusivity Program, which offers a 6-month patent extension incentive to companies who test new drugs in appropriate child-focused trials. The program has proven effective. Under it, pharmaceutical companies have studied more than 300 products and have made 115 available for pediatric use. A similar program recently was introduced by the European Union. But a study just published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, questions what it says may be the program's overly generous return on investment. In 8 of 9 drugs studied, the pharmaceutical company benefited. The range of net economic return to industry varied widely, but in the most lucrative, the value of the patent extension and the additional protected sales was 20 to 74 times the cost of the trials. Now, in the next few months, the U.S. Congress will reconsider the program, which is up for renewal this year. The study raises knife-edge questions. Does the federal policy provide the prescription drug agents industry with a windfall profit? I'm sure you've heard that terminology. What is a fair net economic compensation? And does it reflect the true cost of developing pharmaceuticals and of clinical trials? Would a shorter extension be more realistic, or would it jeopardize a proven effective policy? A broader technology-linked public policy question is whether the U.S. Congress or the appropriate federal agency might wish to encourage more genetically developed personal approaches to pediatric drugs, as opposed to dosage adaptation of broad-spectrum adult-developed pharmaceuticals. This illustrates a knife-edge policy that is technology-linked. Consider another example. In areas of high biodiversity, organisms which cannot flee their predators, such as plants or corals, are evolutionarily predisposed to develop high toxicity. Biologists have been exploring such substances for the possibility that they may be developed into drugs useful in treating human disease. The harvested material is called cyanobacteria and is being used to prospect for organisms which can act against ailments such as malaria, dengue fever, and parasitic diseases. This example raises interesting questions about who should profit from patents based on biodiversity found in developing countries. What should be the standard for bioprospecting? Should it benefit the company whose scientists took initiative? Or should it benefit the venue or the country of origin, or both, and to what degree? If the extracted material were a mineral or oil, there would be little question that the nation or place of origin would receive at least some compensation. U.S. patent law tends to protect the individuals who do the intellectual work needed to turn raw biological discoveries into marketable products. International law does not yet address such issues, although there are discussions beginning. But areas of high biodiversity are not always found in developing countries. Our national parks have become increasingly valuable as other ecosystems around the nation and around the world have been altered. Scientists increasingly have been bioprospecting for extremophiles, organisms which may have unique properties and uses, in the thermal waters of Yellowstone National Park or the deep caves of the Carlsbad Caverns. At first, the National Park Service received no compensation. That is changing. Now the Park Service has begun requiring agreements, including potential compensation with scientists or entities who are bioprospecting. Obviously, as thinking individuals, you have pondered the double bind which these and similar questions pose for scientists, of course, but also for legislators, for policymakers, for society as a whole, for all of us, really. And you have done so amid the roiling agora, where the knife-edge issues of the day are debated alongside Britney Spears' hair, and where they intersect with public policy. But each of these examples has specific public policy components, and each needs careful attention and consideration. Now, as I may have implied at the outset in referencing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I actually have a particular interest in, as you might expect, and concern for energy, and in particular, energy security. Now, if we accept the IPCC's conclusion that human activity is, quote, very likely, unquote, the cause of climate change, then we could argue that it is human global energy use which is primarily at issue, although this is not the only factor. I believe that addressing the world's energy needs in an environmentally sustainable way is the central challenge of our time. While many speak in terms of national energy independence, I prefer the term energy security, because a narrow focus on U.S. energy interests alone, without regard for the energy interests of other countries, is neither practical nor productive. Energy today is interrelated, interdependent, and global. There is no real energy independence. Global energy supply is governed by multiple interrelated factors with international dimension. These include global trade, including energy trade and markets, international travel, terrorism, political turmoil, and instability in exporting countries, wars, piracy, natural disasters, and overall supply chain vulnerabilities, as economic researcher Daniel Yergin posits. Our planet's 6 billion people are pressuring the world's energy supplies, and that pressure is mounting as developing nations expand their economies and raise their standards of living, as well they should. As the population nears 8 to 10 billion people at mid-century, energy demands will grow proportionately. And if we fail to address the energy needs of the poorest countries, millions will remain in poverty, with inadequate health care, scarce water and food, lack of basic education, unable to function in the global innovation enterprise. They will continue to feel keenly the imbalance in distribution of wealth and privilege. This can lead to a sense of humiliation, of hopelessness, to unrest and instability, conditions easily exploited by extremist groups, increasing the global threat of terrorism, or to human rights abuses, corruption, despotism, and other forms of poor governance. So failures to address these global asymmetries and imbalances has worldwide repercussions with local implications. The pressures translate into global instability. Again, why should other countries not wish to develop? But more global development requires more energy. And without new approaches, more countries will be competing for finite resources. So stable, sustainable energy from diverse sources is inextricably linked with our own economic well-being and with our own national security, and both are linked to global security. Given that, nonetheless, individual countries have worked assiduously to ensure their own energy security with as much independence as possible. For example, more than 3 decades ago, France, a nation with few coal and natural gas resources and virtually no oil resources, embraced a national nuclear power policy for generating its electricity. And today, France's 59 nuclear power plants generate almost 80% of that nation's electrical power and provides upwards of $3 billion in annual revenues from sales of surplus power as the world's largest net exporter of electricity. Now, there's never been a nuclear power accident involving a light water reactor in France, and the nation safely reprocesses much of its nuclear waste. Because its nuclear energy produces no emissions, France has the lowest rate of carbon equivalent emissions in the European Union and is predicted to have the least difficulty among EU members in meeting its greenhouse gas emission goals under the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. Now, the environmental benefits of nuclear power also are beginning to be recognized in the United States, where the modest but respectable 20% of U.S. electricity generated by nuclear power represents nearly 3/4 of the nation's emissions-free electricity production. Of course, there is heightened concern in this country over the safety and security of nuclear reactors, especially since September 11, 2001. But nuclear power reactors are not the only arena where nuclear materials come into play. Let me just let you think about these quickly. There are approximately 18.4 million nuclear medicine, imaging, and therapeutic procedures performed annually in the United States, according to the Society of Nuclear Medicine, a figure which has been increasing annually. Nuclear byproduct material is used in calibration sources, in radiopharmaceuticals, bone mineral analyzers, portable fluoroscopic imaging devices, brachytherapy sources and devices, gamma stereotactical surgery devices, and teletherapy units. Radioisotopes are used to identify drug-resistant strains of malaria, tuberculosis, and other diseases. Radiation is used in sterilizing bone, skin, and other tissues required for tissue grafts to heal serious injuries. And nuclear techniques are used to optimize malnutrition studies. Agricultural productivity is enhanced by the development of new plant varieties through radiation-induced mutation. Researchers are working on using nuclear techniques to develop new plant strains adaptable to cultivation in saline lands. Isotope hydrology is used to map underground aquifers to improve groundwater management, as well as to investigate and recover from contamination events. But there are drawbacks. The U.S. government reported in 2003 that 1,500 radiation sources were believed to have been lost or stolen in the United States since 1996. More than half had never been recovered. Anti-terrorism officials, conducting an aerial background radiation survey of New York in August of 2005, discovered 80 unexpected hotspots around the city, according to the Government Accountability Office. Sensors picked up large quantities of radium in the soil of Great Kills Park, part of Staten Island's Gateway National Park. Have you been there recently? The park has been closed, and other hotspot sources have been under investigation. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, lists 26 radionuclides of concern at 3 threshold activity levels, categories 1, 2, or 3, with 1 being the highest risk. 16 are commonly used in sources, while the other 10 are unlikely to be used in sealed sources that would have activity levels high enough to be placed in the 3 categories. The IAEA estimates that there are more than 100,000 Category 1 and 2 sources worldwide. The number of Category 3 sources exceeds 1 million. Now, previous IAEA reports indicate that up to 70 radiation sources go missing each year. And the agency reported 263 smuggling attempts involving radiation sources over the last 14 years. In the Republic of Georgia, more than 280 orphaned radioactive sources, that is, sources outside of regulatory control, have been recovered since the mid-1990s. Some of these sources have lethal levels of radioactivity. For example, mobile cesium irradiators containing approximately 3,500 curies of cesium-137. What prevents an armed theft of highly enriched uranium, HEU, at one of the 99, not power, but research reactors around the world, with uranium enriched to 90% or greater uranium-235? Given that Libya obtained nuclear weapons blueprints on a compact disk, and given the enthusiasm of black market merchants, why should we be confident that those plans were not copied and shared with other countries and subnational groups? Why should we have any assurance that the political upheavals of the next 2, 3, or 4 decades, maybe the next 2, 3, or 4 years, will not result in acquisition and use of a nuclear weapon by an extremist group? With the rapid pace of technology morphing from discipline to discipline, what is the likelihood that based on one of the next several generation wireless technologies, a nuclear weapons control system could be hacked, leaked, or even sabotaged by a disgruntled insider or an outsider for that matter? Now, to the concern over the control of nuclear materials afloat in the world, we must add concern over how nations comport themselves internationally. India and Pakistan essentially are equally armed with nuclear weapons in what has been for years a dangerous standoff based on deeply rooted historical and ethnic divisions that could cloud the potentially devastating consequences of conflict between them. The recent activities of North Korea and Iran, of course, are of current concern. North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in January of 2003, severed nuclear inspection arrangements with the IAEA, and launched its first nuclear test last October. The recent Marathon 6-party talks in Beijing apparently have reached an agreement which requires North Korea to close down its Yongbyon reactor within 60 days in exchange for 50,000 tons of fuel oil, and provides a positive model for international intervention and leadership. Now, I have to tell you that this is kind of a second time around. There was a whole approach wrapped up in what was called the Keto Project that had essentially the same focus and reached a certain point. Now, the motivation and nuclear goals of Iran remain unclear, although IAEA inspectors confirmed this month that Iran is equipping its Natanz uranium enrichment plant, bringing it closer to building an atomic bomb in defiance of the December 2006 UN Security Council resolution. So obviously, the propensity for the development of nuclear weapons is of ongoing and growing national and international concern. But with recent history as a backdrop, and with these and other scenarios as potential future challenges, the critical question is this: how do we assure ourselves that countries, bilateral arrangements, and multilateral frameworks, such as the IAEA, will be staying ahead of the game, looking in all the right places, catching up with catastrophes before they happen, and distributing its limited resources according to areas of greatest risk? A truly knife-edge question, which plays into global energy security, because people want nuclear power for energy. Now, my purpose in this iteration is not to frighten, but to illustrate the two sides of nuclear knife-edge issues. Nuclear energy and its sources bring enormous benefit, and that was what I was trying to illustrate earlier, bring enormous benefit to humankind across a variety of fields, but are fraught with very real and justified concern about the diversion of nuclear materials to less than peaceful purposes. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? How can we gain the benefits and mitigate the risks? That's what the Nuclear Regulatory's mission really is about. How can we find the right balance? Can we? What must the public understand? What must our leaders understand and do? What is the role of science and technology? These are truly knife-edge questions. Now, when we look at the issue of global energy security, a more realistic focus consists of addressing four factors. First is optimum source relative to sector use. There's no one silver bullet. A second is consideration of life cycle costs, energy conservation, and environmental protection. A third is redundancy of supply and diversity of source overall. And a fourth is infrastructure investment and maintenance. But this can only be achieved through innovation, because we must innovate the technologies which uncover and exploit new fossil energy sources, such as oil shale or methane hydrates, and improve their extraction. But we must as well innovate the technologies which conserve energy and which protect the environment. And we must innovate the technologies which lead to alternative energy sources, which are reliable, cost-effective, safe, as environmentally benign as possible, and sustainable. It will be in our national capacity for innovation that we seek and have the ability to achieve these goals. Innovation and the development and exploitation of new technologies, particularly on this scale, requires two crucial elements. One, consistent investment in human talent, in our human intellectual capital. The educated, prepared, professional scientists, engineers, and mathematicians who make up the intellectual security of a robust science and engineering enterprise. And second, strong, consistent leadership in the agora to overcome public distrust and confusion over science, to resolve the knife-edge issues as best we can, and to generate sound, progressive public policy. Now, I have been speaking for some time about the critical need to invest in U.S. human talent in science and engineering, because several trends are converging. The first is the aging, and I'm one of those, well-preserved, and the imminent retirement of today's scientists and engineers, many who came of age in the post-Sputnik era. The second is an insufficient number of young scholars in our nation's science and engineering pipeline to replace those who will retire. A third is a decline in the number of international scientists and students who come to the United States to work, to study, and to remain. And this group long has been an important source of skilled talent for the U.S. science and engineering enterprise. In fact, nearly 40% of the PhDs in our current science and engineering workforce were born someplace else. But growing opportunities for study and work in their home countries and elsewhere abroad are making themselves felt here. And we have the concurrent change in our national demographics. Young women and ethnic minority youth now account for more than half of our student population. This new majority traditionally has been underrepresented in science and engineering. They have few role models and mentors to pattern themselves after among faculty and researchers. And yet it is from this group, this underrepresented majority, that the next generations of scientists and engineers also must come. Now, much of the rise in federal support for basic research in the last decade has been driven by increases in support for biomedical research. But over the same period, support for basic research in the physical sciences and engineering, until very recently, has been in decline. More recently, in fact, NIH support for biomedical research has in fact plateaued. But since education and research potentiate each other in science and engineering, this has had a deleterious effect on the creation of a new generation of scientists and engineers. These factors comprise what I call the quiet crisis. It is quiet because it takes decades to educate a physicist or a nuclear engineer. So the true impact unfolds only gradually over time. It is a crisis because discoveries and innovations create the new industries which keep our economy thriving, and the innovations which mitigate the global scourges that breed suffering and global instability. Without innovation, we fail as a nation and as a world. Now, reports by major corporate, academic, government, and private sector entities all have recognized these trends and warn of the consequences if we fail to act. And the national conversation is engaged. We are at a point to turn rhetoric into reality. Two of those efforts, one by the national academies and captured in a report referred to as Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and the other by the U.S. Council on Competitiveness through their National Innovation Initiative, have led to a number of recommendations. And because of these and other efforts throughout last year, the President and members of the Congress from both political parties recognized the need to do more. Many efforts to increase basic research funding, to educate the next generation of scientists and engineers, and to address energy security were introduced. Members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate heeded the call when they voted to pass the fiscal year 07 continuing resolution. The measure will freeze funding for most domestic and foreign aid programs. However, there are modest but critically needed funding increases for research agencies such as the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Energy Office of Science. The President has signed the spending bill into law. In addition, the President's fiscal 2008 budget proposal released last week proposes a 7.2% increase in fiscal year 08 for basic research and proposes provisions in the No Child Left Behind Act to improve mathematics education and to require science proficiency of all students by 2020. And much of what's in these various legislative proposals, the bills, the President's initiatives have come out of these private and academic and academies' efforts. But you know, in the international arena, there's a quiet crisis as well, because technological innovation is crucial in a world concerned about trafficking in nuclear materials and the proliferation of nuclear weapons programs. Consider the role that advanced technology has played in recent years in helping the IAEA to expose clandestine nuclear programs. Satellite monitoring has played an important role in detecting change in nuclear and other facilities. And advanced analysis techniques, including 3D visualization technologies, have enhanced the ability to interpret these changes. Laboratory analysis with sophisticated analytical techniques through the network of analytical laboratories on which the IAE relies uses an array of advanced nuclear forensic techniques, including fission track particle analysis, as well as secondary ion mass spectroscopy, and I won't make your eyes glaze over by talking in detail about them. The point, though, is that these and other techniques have played a seminal role in reconstructing the history and the nature of past and present nuclear programs, in particular in understanding the chronology and types of activity and the origin of the nuclear material involved. But clearly the IAEA or any safeguards program of the future will continue to be in need of innovative technologies to stay ahead of the curve. And when we consider human capital, the IAEA itself has a problem as well, because it actually has an aging workforce. It has a mandatory retirement age of 62. It is also in competition with the various countries it works with and from which it draws its staff in competing for limited resource. And so there's actually been a migration in the relative percentage of PhDs and other advanced degree holders at the IAEA compared to where it was just a decade ago. Now, for the IAEA inspector pool as well, a geographically and culturally diverse workforce would be an immense, and is an immense, and an enviable strength. It should be a strategic asset, a means of enhancing cultural sensitivity, of bridging language barriers, supplying critical regional and cultural insights, and in some cases, perhaps improving ease of access. Does that sound similar relative to what our own State Department is talking about? But at the very least, it should prompt active recruitment strategies in every region and country with the relevant organizations and academic institutions. So returning once more to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the panel was established by the United Nations, specifically the UN Environment Program and the UN Specialized Agency, the World Meteorological Organization, to assess scientific, technical, and relevant socioeconomic information to provide governments with an agreed-upon view of the science of climate change upon which to base their national policies. And I have used that report in my remarks this evening as a touchstone because it warns us that without innovation, we put at risk the very future we wish for human society and for our planet. And so the knife edge of science and public policy impels all of us, especially those of us here, to leadership. Leadership to examine and to address the distrust and confusion in the agora which surround the knife-edge issues of science. Leadership to resolve the quiet crisis, to assure that all young people have a sound understanding of science and that they are inspired and encouraged to tackle these difficult subjects early, and that we instill in them the excitement and the hope of science. Leadership to assure that young people have the kind of higher education which addresses global leadership and the function of science in policy issues. Leadership to base public policies on sound science. Leadership to tackle the innovations we must have to ensure our national security, our global security, and a global future. Leadership toward a cultural shift to value science and those who do it. This leadership is required of all of us. Elected leaders, of course, government officials, of course, but leadership extends to each of us within our own spheres of influence. In the end, we must inaugurate a new nexus of science and leadership. In the end, this is about the kind of human society we want to build and be part of. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we have time for a few questions. There are microphones here and here, one in the audience there and there. If you could just move to the microphone if you'd like to ask a question. Let me actually take the opportunity to ask my first question, which was, if in terms of the lack of science and engineers and so forth, if you were to sort of put your finger on the single biggest lever that we're not taking advantage of, and that if we don't move quickly, we'll never have a chance to get back, what would it be?
Teachers. You know, a person with whom I grew up and went through what we call junior high, you probably call middle school, and high school with, Bennery Pratt Wiley is here. And I think she will remember that we had a special cadre of teachers, but it was a funny kind of way we ended up with this special cadre of teachers. Now, I began the public schools in Washington, D.C. when schools were segregated by law. And then after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, in 1955, the schools were desegregated. And what people didn't realize was that at that time, the schools picked a very special cadre of teachers to begin to integrate the schools as those of us who were the children went to these schools. And these were teachers, primarily women, African American women, who, if they were my age or younger, would have been probably classics professors at Harvard, and not Latin teachers necessarily, mathematics professors or mathematicians, and not necessarily high school math teachers, and so on. But we were blessed with having this cadre of teachers who were simply excellent, very knowledgeable in their subject matter, devoted to teaching, and wanted to instill in us a much higher perspective of what we could achieve in our lives. And so I've come away from that, and as the president of a university today, I remain convinced. That's why many of you who may be Harvard students are here. You come because of those from whom you will learn. Teachers.
Great answer. Okay, right up here.
Good evening, Dr. Jackson. My name is Jeff Ginsberg. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. You may have just answered my question there, but I'll ask it anyway. Before coming to the school, I was the founder and director of a after-school science education initiative here in Massachusetts for United Way for elementary and middle school. And after all the research and all the data, what we kept finding was the big problem was science just hadn't been cool. It just hadn't been cool yet. And I just came from a dinner where someone talked about in Japan, the recent finale of a robotics competition had almost a third of the population watching on TV. Here in the forum, even the biggest sellout I've ever seen was for Stephen Colbert. You know, it's not for something involving math and science. So we have this sort of issue of in the pipeline, as you mentioned. And I'm wondering at RPI or in all the experiences you've had at the various institutions, how can we deal with sort of the root issue, the cultural issue, and that math and science is not at the heart of many of the things we do, especially with youth in the United States? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Part of the reason I spoke of the need to value science and those who do it is precisely because of what you're trying to lay out here. At Rensselaer, we actually work with Dean Kamen, you may know him, with the first robotics competition, partly because Dean is Dean, as you well know, but also because he manages to bring together over 10,000 young people in a final national competition that comes out of a number of regional competitions in what he likes to call the sort of national championships in at least technology-rooted approaches to science, and to really excite the kids. So you have to grab them early. There has to be consistency of intervention. Part of the reason I spent all this time talking about nuclear materials is that I find that to get the public's attention, you have to do the yin and the yang. Namely, on the one hand, it is important for people to understand the promise of science, for the young people, the interest of it, but the cool things you can do with it, the important things that come out of science, the impact, and the wealth creation that comes from scientific discovery and technological innovation, which, let's face it, does motivate some people. But at the same time, we sit around every day and we're bombarded with things on the TV and other forms of media, particularly the internet, and we're frightened by what we hear and see, and many times think that there are things we cannot do to have an effect. And I try to get people to understand the critical role of science and scientists when married with the public policy process in addressing some of these issues. I also am a believer that fundamental, basic, good education predicated on fundamentals is important, because becoming a scientist, learning those things that one must learn, is a cumulative process. But it begins on a strong early foundation that can give young people the confidence to persist. And so having a myriad of programs, having initiatives like some of those that are now proposed in legislation to create cadres of discipline-based teachers who approximate the kind of teachers I had in middle and high school, I think it's very important, because the teachers are with the young people every day. And more than we might appreciate, even today, young people look up to their teachers. And so we have programs like yours that I think are fantastic, that seek to intervene, to supplement, to inspire, to motivate. But in the end, they're not going to be substitutes for what happens every day, every school day, in the classroom and the school more generally. And so that's why I've been involved in a number of these national efforts to change the construct relative to teaching.
Right up here.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your insight and inspiration. My name is Ed Backrack. I'm a mid-career student.
Thank you.
Several weeks ago, I was speaking with a former theoretical physicist from MIT. And he told me that he had started giving up his career as a physicist in his late 30s and transitioned his career elsewhere. And when I asked him why, he said that theoretical physics and much of science and innovation depends upon a young mind that is more flexible and more imaginative. And while he was still interested, it's like a young man that ages and your body can't perform just as your mind can't. So I'm not asking you to engage in age discrimination, But is there any validity to this thought? And if so, does this add further urgency to the human resource problem?
Well, I think it's fair to say that people's desire to do different things can change over time. You know, in my own career, I did theoretical physics research for 15 years at Bell Labs, and I was a professor. But when the opportunity came along and I was asked by President Clinton to chair the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which meant stepping back from research and applying my knowledge, because my actual PhD is in elementary particle theory, which, as you know, is related to nuclear physics. Apply that knowledge and to marry it with public policy to try to make a difference in a very important arena at a level in the government that was pretty high. I thought it was not something that I should step away from, knowing it would mean that I would step away from doing research every day. But then I was actually asked to continue, but I had the opportunity to become the president of Rensselaer and help other young people and our faculty do their work and make discoveries. And so I don't know that I would agree that those who are older than 30, although that is the statement people make about mathematics and theoretical physics. I think I did a few things after I was 30 in physics. But people's interests change. And then, of course, we all know great scientists, great physicists who stay active well into their 80s and beyond if they live that long. So, thank you.
Wasn't there this guy with really white frizzy hair? Right over here.
My name is Rachel Esplin, and I'm a freshman at the college. My question is about this agra you talked at the beginning of your, and throughout your address. One of the sectors you talked about was the religious sector. Now, I know that a lot recently, there's been cooperation between various religious figures and other individuals on the environmental front, especially with challenges of global warming. What are some other ways you think we can encourage cooperation with this sector between like the academy and government and science, and not just necessarily in energy and environmental issues, but also other bioethical issues?
Well, I think there are beginning to be more and more efforts. Non-governmental organizations have always played an important role either in pressuring government and in other cases working with government to focus in areas that, from whether we talk about things in agriculture, in environmental justice in terms of where industrial facilities are placed, areas of nuclear power, biomedical research. And I think it really depends on leadership in government, leadership among those who have the privilege of making decisions, particularly decisions at the governmental level. You spoke about religion, and I'm on the board of Georgetown University, which, as you know, is a Jesuit university, probably the standout Jesuit university in this country. And actually, there are a number of members of the Society of Jesus on the board as well. And Georgetown is having a discussion about what it will do in science, but to do it in a way that is consistent with the Jesuit tradition. And so there are a couple of areas they're choosing to focus on, one of which is global health. Another is interreligious dialogue, and then to try to bring those together. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because what it sees is a unique opportunity to have a global focus in health, using science to address issues, but building through a network where the Jesuits are around the world, many of whom are working in what we would call developing or underdeveloped countries. So there's kind of a natural partnership in that arena. So that's one example.
Right over here.
Let's see, is it working? Welcome, Dr. Jackson. This is my first time at the Kennedy School of Government. And the only reason that I know that is I couldn't find it. I asked a lot of the Harvard students how to get here, and they didn't know how. So I took it upon myself and gratification to find it on my own. So I welcome you. My question is, to pre-limit, is I saw a movie called The Saint, 95 or 98, with Val Kilmer and Elizabeth Shue. She happened to go to Wellesley College. And they talked about global warming and fossil fuel. To you, is there any chemical, physic, or mathematical formula for fossil fuel, or as you see it, or global warming today?
Well, let me start at the beginning. I'm not an environmental scientist, but as they say, many of my friends are. And I would say that people do believe, and I believe them because they are, world-class scientists, that there are effects of the use of hydrocarbon-based energy sources on and the resultant release of carbon dioxide and other kinds of gases into the atmosphere that they feel, through a very careful study, are leading to a pattern having to do with global warming. And so that is my answer to your question, which is why, even as people look for other fossil sources, and people are looking at things like methane hydrates that primarily occur, in the deep ocean, people are worrying more about issues of carbon sequestration and how to make use of sources that have, in ways that have less environmental impact.
Right up here.
Hello, my name is Martin Mbaya. I'm a first-year MPP student, public policy, trained as an engineer, and I had a two-part question for you. As an undergraduate in my senior year, we set up a program that enabled students to go work in universities in Africa, high schools and universities around technology. And it's done an excellent job of bridging two cultures, two different places. What do you sense is the role going forward of American universities in making an impact, particularly around science and technology in Africa? And secondly, for someone who's making a transition from engineering into policy, what is the one area you'd be telling me to focus on? And I know I have several other colleagues in here. What's that one area we should be focusing on? Okay. Going back to your overarching theme of
Right.
the quiet crisis.
Well, I think there is, although there's not as much public discussion and action as we would like to see, an increasing focus on Africa and what can be done. In our own case, I'll tell you about two things which you might find interesting. We have an alumnus who actually is wealthy and is an entrepreneur. He helped to found a company when he was an undergraduate, which actually then made him and his co-founders very rich. And he was an electrical engineer. But then he went off and he went to filmmaking school. But when the war in Iraq began, and he looked at the devastation and the unemployment, actually, of engineers in Iraq, he formed an organization called Jumpstart International with his own money. And what it did was it employed hundreds, if not thousands, of Iraqis to tear down war-damaged buildings and to rebuild. And now he's has an activity in Gaza with trying to create an institute of technology. He endowed a fund at Rensselaer called the Change the World Challenge, and it's specifically oriented to challenging students to apply their science and engineering skills and to come together with those in other fields to try to address an issue that relates to having a societal impact, particularly in a part of the world that is either troubled or undeveloped. So we have a number of our students in architecture and engineering that have begun to really focus. And so I think leadership and providing the means for students to exercise those capabilities and interests, I think are critically important. If you ask me the one thing, and it's hard when people ask you one thing for one thing, because there never is just a one thing. You know, the Africa is becoming of greater and greater strategic interest to many, many countries, the United States, China, others, because it is actually a virtual gold mine, and I am using that deliberately, of oil and the kind of minerals that actually and materials that are critically used to power many of the industries that have led to the information revolution, you know, heavy metals, other things. So if you were going to focus in an area, I would focus in this in two ways. One, on energy. Africa's role in global energy security, but how it can be used to secure the future of African nations. And to get into these issues of rights and recompense relative to extractive industries. I think that's an interesting area.
Right, we're just going to have time for two more questions. Next one's right here.
Hi, Dr. Jackson. Thank you for joining us today. I'm also an engineer like Martin and interested in appropriate technologies for development. However, prior to coming here today, I was talking with Professor Lonnie Guinier about her book, Meritocracy, Inc. And part of what we were saying is that in addition
I can't
to...
hear you.
Come close to the microphone.
You can put it... Yeah,
Sure.
Right.
In addition to the need for teachers, it seems that some admission criteria are biased towards families that come from wealth. So I was wondering...
Come from?
Wealth.
Wealth.
So I was wondering, in your role at Rensselaer, what steps you have taken to recruit a more diverse student body?
Well, we do just that. I mean, first of all, you know, I've often said that you know, we start at the wrong end of the paragraph when we talk about access, because the real discussion should not begin at the college classroom door. Because when it begins at the college classroom door, we get into these kind of do-loop discussions about who's qualified and who's not. The real point relates to an issue that the young man who asked me one of the first questions did, and that has to do with intervention strategies earlier in terms of intervening. And I think universities have a role in this, although we have to be careful that universities are not put into the role of doing the job that the K through 12 system must do. And that's why when the dean asked me what I thought was most important, I said teachers. It's because we have to wade in and really address the issue of the quality, the consistency of K through 12 education. And if we really do that, and really have a national commitment to educate all of our young people to a certain level, then these sorts of questions, I won't say they'll go away, because people always have biases and those they like better than others and so on, but we can at least mitigate some of the effects of those.
This will have to be the last question.
Dr. Jackson, it's a pleasure to have a physicist give a talk from this stage. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School now, but I did my doctorate and postdoctorate in physics before coming here. And actually, my question follows on from the question that the gentleman asked up there about what to focus on, and your response that there's so many things to focus on.
Yeah.
And my question is, how do we engage scientists, particularly young scientists who are being trained in the public policy process early enough that they have the experience necessary
Right.
to be able to get more involved and do what you've done. And to put a little pressure on the dean here, how do we engage more young scientists in getting involved with programs like this? Or what more can schools like this do to outreach to people with scientific expertise to really push that forward into the marriage of science and public policy?
Well, I mentioned to Dean Elwood that, in fact, at Rensselaer, we're actually putting into place a global experience requirement for all of our undergraduates. Because as a university president, our greatest point of intervention with our students is when they are undergraduates. And for a school, 50% of whose students are engineering students, and 25% of whose students are science students. This is a non-trivial feat. And we are beginning, and we have identified the freshman class that entered this year as the first class who will do this. But interestingly enough, the dean who's leading the charge is the dean of engineering. And what it really requires for us is not just to let's send them abroad and maybe have somebody go with them and so on, is that we actually have to structure relationships with other universities, with multinational companies, with indigenous companies in the countries we're going to, with NGOs and so on, for our students to be productively engaged. But our intent is that before they go, in addition to language training and all of that, that they actually then use the technologies that they so well use, such as the internet, to actually engage in a dialogue with their counterparts abroad or with those they would work with to define what they might work on. And so this is a way that sort of gets them into public policy on a global scale in ways that naturally draw on their engineering and science abilities and interests. It then creates for them, I think, a natural broader awareness and multicultural sophistication, and it forces the issue that the solutions, while heavily enabled by science, are not totally solvable by science alone. And so, rather than sort of beating people over the head to say you must do public policy, the point is you could think of it as backing them in, but we think it's fronting them in to that arena in a way that is natural for them. So that's where we are.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.